My name is Hans Müller, and in the winter of 1984, I was stationed as a border guard along the Berlin Wall. I suppose it's worth mentioning that I never wanted to be there. Few of us did. But in East Germany, your choices weren't really your own. You did as you were told, and you kept your head down. It was safer that way. Life as a guard was dull, but it carried a constant undercurrent of tension. We were meant to watch for deserters, those brave or desperate enough to try and escape to the west. It didn't happen often, but when it did, things got ugly fast. Orders were simple. Stop them by any means necessary. They drilled that into us during training. But I always wondered if I'd really be able to do it. Shoot another human being, I mean. A fellow German. I lived in a cramped barracks near the wall with a few other guards. The walls were thin, the beds hard, and the air always smelled faintly of damp concrete. There was Klaus, my patrol partner, who always found a way to make light of even the grimmest situations. Then there was our superior, Sergeant Kruger, a man whose face seemed permanently set in a frown. He didn't tolerate nonsense, and he definitely didn't tolerate mistakes. It was a bitterly cold night when things started to get strange. "Keep your eyes sharp," Klaus said, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. We were patrolling a section of the wall near the outer edge of our assigned zone. The snow crunched beneath our boots as we walked side by side, our rifles slung across our shoulders. You never know when some poor fool might try their luck. I nodded, more out of habit than agreement. In truth, I wasn't expecting much of anything. Most nights passed without incident. We walked, we checked the perimeter, and we reported back. That was it. But something about that night felt different. The air was too still, the silence too heavy. Even Klaus, usually full of chatter, seemed quieter than usual. We had just reached a bend in the wall when I saw it. "Hey, did you see that?" I whispered, stopping in my tracks. "See what?" Klaus asked, turning to look at me. "There, on top of the wall. I thought I saw someone." Klaus squinted, scanning the top of the concrete barrier. The wall loomed high above us, cold and gray under the dim glow of the floodlights. Nothing moved. "Probably just your eyes playing tricks on you," Klaus said with a shrug. "It happens in this light." I nodded, but a nagging feeling lingered in the back of my mind. I could have sworn I'd seen a figure, a dark shape, just for a moment before it disappeared. Maybe Klaus was right. Maybe it was nothing. We continued our patrol, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. The wall seemed different that night, almost alive. I know how that sounds, but it's the only way I can describe it. The concrete, usually so solid and unmoving, seemed to pulse faintly in the corner of my vision. By the time we returned to the barracks, I was exhausted. Klaus didn't seem fazed by the night's patrol. He kicked off his boots, flopped onto his bunk, and was snoring within minutes. I, on the other hand, lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The image of that shadowy figure wouldn't leave my mind. Eventually, I drifted off into a restless sleep. I dreamt of the wall that night. In my dream, it stretched endlessly in both directions, far longer than it ever could in real life. The concrete was cracked and crumbling, and from those cracks seeped a pale, ghostly light. I tried to look away, but something compelled me to keep walking along the wall. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them. Figures climbing the wall, their limbs moving in unnatural, jerky motions. They didn't look human. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their eyes were empty, hollow sockets. I woke up gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. The barracks were dark, the only sound the faint snoring of my comrades. I rubbed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It was just a dream. That's what I told myself. Just a bad dream. But the unease didn't go away. The next night, Klaus and I were assigned to the same patrol route. I didn't mention the dream to him. He already thought I was being jumpy, and I didn't want to give him more reason to tease me. But as we walked along the wall, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. "You all right, Hans?" Klaus asked after a while. "You're quieter than usual." "Yeah, I'm fine," I said quickly. "Just tired." Klaus nodded, and we continued in silence. But then, just as we rounded the same bend as the night before, I saw it again. "There, on the wall," I whispered urgently. Klaus followed my gaze, but once again, there was nothing there. The top of the wall was empty, just a long stretch of concrete illuminated by the floodlights. "Hans, I think you need to get some sleep," Klaus said, giving me a concerned look. "You're seeing things." I wanted to argue, to insist that I wasn't imagining it. But what could I say? That I'd seen a shadow that vanished the moment I tried to point it out. Klaus wouldn't believe me. Hell, I wasn't even sure I believed myself. We finished the patrol without further incident, but that night the dream returned. This time it was more vivid. I stood at the base of the wall, watching as the figures climbed higher and higher. Their hands left dark smudges on the concrete, like soot or ash. When I tried to call out to them, they turned to face me, their hollow eyes locking onto mine. I woke up with a start, my body drenched in cold sweat. Something was wrong. I didn't know what, but I could feel it in my bones. The following morning, I decided to report the incidents to Sergeant Kruger. I didn't expect much. Kruger wasn't exactly the understanding type, but I felt like I had to say something. "Apparitions?" Kruger repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Are you serious, Miller?" "Yes, sir. I've seen them twice now during night patrols. They look like people trying to climb the wall, but when I get closer, they disappear." Kruger stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Listen, Miller," he said. "You've been working hard, and these night shifts can mess with your head. You're probably just tired. Take a day off, get some rest, and stop spreading nonsense. We don't need any more rumors around here." I wanted to protest, to tell him that I wasn't imagining things. But what was the point? He wouldn't believe me. No one would. As I left his office, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I glanced over my shoulder, but the hallway was empty. Still, the unease lingered, like a shadow I couldn't escape. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Despite Sergeant Kruger's dismissive attitude, I couldn't let go of what I'd seen. Something was happening at the wall, something beyond explanation. Klaus noticed my unease the next evening as we geared up for another patrol. "You all right, Hans?" he asked, adjusting his rifle strap. "You've been acting strange, more than usual." He gave me a half smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, just tired," I muttered, which was only partly true. The restless nights and haunting dreams were wearing me down, but it was more than that. Ever since I first saw the figure on the wall, I'd felt an almost magnetic pull toward that place, as if the wall itself was calling me back. We stepped out into the cold, the night air biting at our faces. The snow had stopped falling, but a thick layer of fog blanketed the ground, muffling our footsteps as we walked along the perimeter. Klaus tried to make small talk, but I wasn't in the mood. My eyes kept drifting to the top of the wall, half expecting to see another apparition. The first hour passed without incident. We trudged through the snow in silence, our breath forming pale clouds in the darkness. But as we neared the far end of our route, I heard something, a faint scraping sound coming from the other side of the wall. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, gripping my rifle tighter. Klaus stopped and listened, his expression turning serious. "Yeah, sounds like..." He trailed off, cocking his head. The scraping continued, faint but persistent, like someone clawing at the concrete. "Maybe it's just an animal," he added, though he didn't sound convinced. "Stay here," I said, stepping closer to the wall. "Wait, what are you doing?" Klaus hissed. "We're not supposed to get too close." I ignored him and pressed my ear against the cold stone. For a moment, all I heard was the steady thump of my own heartbeat. Then, faintly, I heard it, whispers. Dozens of them, overlapping and indistinct, like a chorus of lost voices. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. Klaus must have seen the look on my face because he grabbed my arm. "Hans, what is it?" "I'm not sure," I said, my voice unsteady. "But something's wrong." "Come on, let's head back," Klaus said firmly. "We can report it and let someone else deal with it." Reluctantly, I nodded, and we turned back toward the barracks. But the unease stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night, the dream returned, more vivid than ever. I was standing in front of the wall, but this time, it wasn't solid. It was crumbling, and through the cracks, I could see pale, emaciated figures reaching out, their fingers clawing at the air. Their mouths moved silently as if screaming, but no sound came out. I tried to step back, but my feet were rooted to the ground. One of the figures reached through a crack and grabbed my wrist, its grip icy cold. I woke up with a start, gasping for breath. My heart was racing and my skin felt clammy despite the cold air in the barracks. I glanced around, half expecting to see one of those figures standing at the foot of my bed, but the room was empty. "It's just a dream," I whispered to myself. "Just a dream." But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The next day, I couldn't focus on anything. I went through the motions of my duties, but my mind kept drifting back to the wall. Klaus noticed my distraction and pulled me aside during our lunch break. "All right, spill it," he said, his tone more serious than usual. "What's going on with you?" I hesitated. Klaus was a good friend, but I wasn't sure how to explain what I'd seen without sounding crazy. Still, I needed to tell someone, and he was the only person I trusted. "I don't know how to explain it," I began, "but something's happening at the wall. I keep seeing things, figures climbing it, whispers in the night, and the dreams, they're getting worse." Klaus stared at me for a long moment before sighing. "Look, Hans, I'm not saying I believe in ghosts or anything, but I've heard stories. Older guards talking about weird stuff happening near the wall. Whispers, shadows, cold spots. They usually chalk it up to nerves or imagination, but..." He trailed off, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. "Maybe there's something more to it." "Do you think we should report it again?" I asked. "To Kruger? No way. He'd just chew us out for wasting his time. Besides, what would we even say? That the wall is haunted?" He shook his head. "No, if we're going to figure this out, we'll have to do it ourselves." I wasn't thrilled about the idea of investigating further, but Klaus was right. If we wanted answers, we couldn't rely on anyone else. That night, we went on patrol together, but this time, we stuck close to the section of the wall where I'd first seen the apparitions. The fog was thicker than ever, and the cold seemed almost unnatural, seeping into my bones despite the layers of clothing I wore. As we walked, I kept my eyes on the wall, searching for any sign of movement. The minutes dragged on, and I began to wonder if we'd see anything at all. But then, just as we reached the far end of our route, I saw it. A pale figure, barely more than a shadow, was climbing the wall. Its limbs moved in slow, jerky motions, and its head turned toward us, revealing hollow, empty eyes. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Do you see it?" I whispered, barely able to speak. Klaus nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, I see it." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, without warning, the figure vanished, dissolving into the fog like smoke. "What the hell was that?" Klaus whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, my heart pounding. But it's real, we both saw it. We stood there in silence, the weight of what we'd just witnessed settling over us. Whatever was happening at the wall, it wasn't just in my head. Something was out there, something beyond our understanding. "We need to get out of here," Klaus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't normal." I nodded and we turned back toward the barracks, our footsteps quick and unsteady. The fog seemed to close in around us, and the whispers returned, faint and distant, as if carried on the wind. By the time we reached the safety of the barracks, we were both shaken. Neither of us spoke as we removed our gear and climbed into our bunks. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and listening to the faint sounds of the night outside. Whatever was happening at the wall, it wasn't over. And deep down, I knew that we were only beginning to uncover something far more terrifying than either of us could have imagined. The next day, neither Klaus nor I could shake off the events of the previous night. Even in daylight, with soldiers moving about the barracks and the familiar hum of daily routines filling the air, there was a heaviness between us. Every time someone mentioned the wall, I felt my stomach tighten. Klaus was unusually quiet during breakfast, barely touching his food. I couldn't blame him. After what we'd seen, pretending everything was normal felt impossible. Eventually, I broke the silence. "We have to go back tonight," I said quietly, keeping my voice low so no one around us could hear. Klaus glanced up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't be serious. We barely made it back without losing our minds." "I know, but we can't ignore this. Something's happening out there, and it's getting worse. What if those things, whatever they are, start coming over the wall?" I paused, giving him a moment to absorb my words. "We have to figure out what's going on before it's too late." He sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "All right, but we do this carefully. If things get bad, we head back immediately. No heroics." I nodded, grateful that he was willing to go along with it. "Agreed. We stick together." That night, the fog returned, thicker than ever. It clung to the ground like a living thing, swirling around our feet as we made our way toward the far end of the patrol route. The cold was sharper, biting through our uniforms and making every breath a visible puff of air. Klaus and I moved in tense silence, our rifles at the ready. Every shadow seemed to shift and flicker in the dim light, and the oppressive quiet made my ears strain for any sound. "There it is again," Klaus whispered, stopping abruptly. I followed his gaze and saw the faint outline of a figure on the wall. It moved with that same jerky, unnatural motion, climbing without effort. This time, however, it didn't vanish when we spotted it. "What do we do?" Klaus asked, his voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. My mind raced, torn between fear and a burning need to understand what we were seeing. Before I could decide, the figure did something new. It turned toward us and began descending on our side of the wall. "Run," I whispered, but neither of us moved. We were frozen, rooted in place by a mix of terror and disbelief. As the figure reached the ground, it became clearer. It looked human. A man in tattered clothes, his face gaunt and pale. But his eyes, they were empty, voids of blackness that seemed to absorb the light around them. "Stay back!" Klaus shouted, raising his rifle. His voice echoed unnaturally in the stillness. The figure didn't respond. It took a slow step forward, and then another. Klaus fired a warning shot into the air, the sound sharp and jarring. Still, the figure advanced. "Hans, we need to go," Klaus said urgently, but I couldn't move. I was transfixed by the figure's empty gaze. Suddenly the ground beneath us trembled, and the air grew colder still. Whispers rose around us, louder and more distinct than before. They came from all directions, a cacophony of voices speaking in languages I didn't understand. "We can't stay here." Klaus grabbed my arm, yanking me back to reality. Together we turned and ran, the whispers growing louder with every step. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of the barracks. By then, my lungs were burning and my legs felt like lead. I leaned against the nearest wall, trying to catch my breath. "What the hell is happening, Hans?" Klaus demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "I don't know," I admitted, wiping sweat from my brow despite the cold. "But it's getting worse. Those things, they're coming through the wall." "We need to tell someone," Klaus said. "Kruger, the captain, anyone. This isn't just our problem anymore." "And what do we tell them?" I asked. "That the wall is haunted? That there are ghosts or whatever those things are, climbing over it?" Klaus didn't respond. He knew as well as I did that no one would believe us. Still, we couldn't just do nothing. "There's one more thing we can try," I said after a moment. "There's an old maintenance tunnel that runs under the wall. Maybe we can find something there, some clue about what's happening." Klaus stared at me as if I'd lost my mind. "You want to go underground, after what we just saw?" "It's the only place we haven't checked," I said. "If we can figure out where these things are coming from, maybe we can stop it." He hesitated, then sighed heavily. "All right, but if this goes south, we're getting out of there fast." The entrance to the maintenance tunnel was hidden behind a row of old supply sheds. We found it easily enough, a rusted metal hatch half buried in the snow. Klaus pried it open with a crowbar, and a blast of cold, stale air hit us. "This is a terrible idea," he muttered as we climbed down the ladder into the darkness below. The tunnel was narrow and damp, with exposed pipes running along the ceiling. Our flashlights cast long, flickering shadows on the walls, and the sound of dripping water echoed around us. "Stay close," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. We moved slowly, our footsteps echoing in the confined space. The air grew colder the deeper we went, and the whispers returned, faint but unmistakable. They seemed to be coming from ahead, drawing us forward. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. At the center of the room was something I can only describe as a rift, a jagged tear in the air, pulsing with an eerie blue light. Around it, figures like the ones we'd seen before moved in and out of the shadows, their hollow eyes fixed on us. "What is that?" Klaus whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, my heart pounding. "But I think it's where they're coming from." As we stood there, the rift pulsed, and a wave of cold air washed over us. The figures began to move toward us, their movements slow but deliberate. "We need to destroy it," I said, raising my rifle. "How?" Klaus asked, panic in his voice. "Shoot the pipes. Maybe we can flood the chamber." Without waiting for a response, I aimed at one of the pipes running along the ceiling and fired. The bullet hit its mark, and a jet of water sprayed out, quickly turning into a torrent. Klaus followed my lead, and soon the chamber was filling with water, the figures slowing as the rising flood engulfed them. "Come on, let's get out of here," I shouted, grabbing Klaus's arm. We turned and ran, the water surging around our ankles. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the figures were crying out in desperation. By the time we reached the ladder, the water was waist-deep. We climbed up as fast as we could, emerging into the cold night air, just as the hatch slammed shut behind us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just stood there, gasping for breath and shivering in the cold. "Do you think it worked?" Klaus asked finally. "I don't know," I admitted, "but for now, the whispers are gone." Klaus nodded, and we made our way back to the barracks in silence. Whatever had been haunting the wall, we'd faced it and survived. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The rift might be closed, but the memories of that night would stay with us forever. Thanks for watching. What did you think of the story? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more stories like this.